I would like to introduce Professor Peter Boag from WSU Vancouver.
I know Cole Thrush, and I have to say I'm very happy to be speaking before he does. He's an excellent speaker. It's going to be a wonderful night for you. So I want to thank Amy Frost and Colin Walker for inviting me tonight, and all the people who've made such a warm reception for me here on Lopez Island, especially Tom and Gail Ruggles, who've given me a wonderful place to stay. I do have a confession. Although I am a native of the Pacific Northwest and I've lived most of my life here, this is my first time on any of the San Juan Islands. Now, it's not that I'm unaware of the San Juans. In fact, in my Pacific Northwest history class, I usually assign a reading on the 1859 Pig War. I have not met any pigs on my trip, but I would like to acknowledge that repercussions of that seemingly long ago event are still felt today, like so much of history is. The outcome of the Pig War, of course, was the rigidification of an international boundary between two imperial powers that fell especially hard on the Northern Straits Coast Salish people. Their lives and communities and world were sliced in two. So I would like to acknowledge them and think about them this evening since we are on their ancestral lands. Okay, I'd like to say a couple words about the title of my talk here. Draw your attention to the bold italics printed words here. But before doing so, the background image is a bird's eye view of Port Townsend in 1878, looking back towards the Olympic Mountains. So the first word, queer, is a word that I'd like to acknowledge is a problematic term. For many of us who identify on the LGBTQ spectrum and are of a certain vintage, like I, that word was hurled at us often when we were young, very vulnerable, dealing with our inner turmoils, and a lot of viciousness was attached to that word. But about 30 years ago, first queer activists, followed by queer scholars, began to reclaim that word as a point of pride and a point of unity, although it still, of course, is a problematic term for even more reasons than what I've mentioned. But I would also say that it is a word that has historical relevance, meaning in my research, even as far back as the late 19th century, here in the Pacific Northwest, there were queer people who I occasionally found in the records did use that term to describe themselves or to identify by. I never found the word gay. Transgender and transsexual were not words that existed then, and the concepts, how we understand those today, they also did not exist. Now, the other word that seems unproblematic is the word rural. But what does rural really mean? Well, that meaning has changed over the years as well. So I want to give you two examples. The first comes from 1920. After the United States Census was conducted, the Census Bureau tabulated up all the results and declared that for the first time in American history, more people in the country lived in urban than rural areas. This is seen often as a real significant event in our history, an indication that the United States had entered the modern urban world. It would become an urban society. But what did rural mean? to go back to my question? Well, in 1920, the Census Bureau defined urban as a place, a community, a town that had a population of more than 2,500. What's the population of Lopez Island? 3,100. Do you live in an urban society? And 30 years prior to that, back in 1890, the Census Bureau defined urban as a place with more than 8,000 people. So it's a problematic term. I want to acknowledge that. And I will be using that term tonight, and who knows what I'm talking about. But I will be talking about a range of places that's probably better to describe as more thinly populated and more densely populated. And queer people existed in all those places. Okay, so in my talk, I want to talk first a little bit about rural and urban and queer identity, kind of the early history of how those were related to each other. Then I'm going to give a couple examples from my research over the years about gender and sexual nonconformity or queerness in rural areas. And then I'm going to end by talking a little bit about the problem of historical records, especially the kind that I use to do my research. And this is really a call to preserve personal documents, queer people to preserve personal documents, and this falls in line with the new proposed plans of the Historical Society here to create an LGBTQ archive. Those are very important. Okay. This is New York City in 1883, somewhat different from Port Townsend. Now, just as the United States began to wrestle in the late 19th century with what urban and rural meant, queer people entered public awareness here in the United States, and they did so in an urban context. That is, they first seemed to begin to appear, and communities of them, in large cities such as New York. Now, at the time, queerness, at the time, the people who took the most interest from a public policy perspective in queer people were officials from the medical and the legal professions. And they defined queerness as sexual perversion. That's the word you will see used then. And to them, sexual perversion was actually considered a disease. Queerness wasn't an identity, but sexual perversion was a disease. And since queer people seemed to first emerge in urban spaces, sexual perversion was thought to be a disease of urban places. So these cities, such as New York and Philadelphia, Chicago, other places in time, the size of them, the scale of them was unprecedented in American history, a country that had been rooted in small towns, an expanding agricultural countryside, an expanding frontier beyond which was what was considered to be wilderness areas. And so there was a lot of concern, there was a lot of uncertainty. What did these big cities mean for American society and the future of the country? And oftentimes, when things are new or we first learn about them or we don't know a lot about them, we tend to be more afraid of them than not. And so there's a great deal of fear about these cities. Now, these cities did have problems, a lot of real problems, but also imagined problems. And so, especially for medical officials, thinking about the human body and what they knew that the human body can endure. And they knew human bodies in small towns and rural spaces. And they thought the urban setting was simply going to overtax people. Too many people crammed into a small area. Of course, there's tainted waters, there's ghettos, there's air pollution, there's lack of open spaces. And it was just felt that the human body wasn't conditioned to survive that sort of thing. And so, as a result, the human body would become weak. the nervous system would deteriorate, and it would be open to invasion from all sorts of different diseases, including sexual perversion. Now, one of the medical officials, or the famous physician in the late 19th century, who promoted this idea, and his work had a real strong influence on the early conceptions of queer people, was this fellow here. His name was George Beard. He was a neurologist, and at that time, neurology and psychology were lumped together. He was from Connecticut. He served as a surgeon during the Civil War. After the Civil War, he finished his medical studies and he practiced in New York City, where he came in contact with a lot of people, including people we would probably identify as gay men. And he wrote a book about different types of sexual diseases. It was called Sexual Neurasthenia. It's pictured here, published in 1884, a year after he actually died. And this is a quotation from that book. Cases of sexual perversion are very much more frequent than is supposed. This class of people do not wish to get well. They enjoy their abnormal life. There are great numbers of such cases in the city of New York. It is quite safe to assume that the strong, healthy farming population, those living outdoors and have well-balanced constitutions of the old-fashioned sort, are not annoyed by perverted sexual desire to the same degree as the delicate, finely organized lads of our cities and of higher civilization. Well, given this, and not surprisingly, one of the great fears in the late 19th century among white, middle-class, urban reformers, who also were Protestants, the great fear was what was happening to all of the young, rural men and women who were leaving the countryside in droves and heading to the city where all kinds of opportunities awaited them. And we think about the growth of these cities, big cities like New York, Chicago in the late 19th and early 20th century, as something that comes from the incredible migration, especially from Europe during this period. But actually, there were more Americans moving from the countryside to the city, contributing to this population growth, than people who were migrating to the United States overseas. So this was a huge concern. And you can see some of this concern expressed in this newspaper article from the rural press in Oregon in 1872. Here may be seen a crowd of young women, fresh and robust, who leave the country to grow pallid and to often stagnate in the hideous circle of corruption in the midst of large cities. There again are a host of young men full of strength and courage who would have been happy had they been content to cultivate the soil. But instead, they enter the attracting whirlpool to be found in the midst of large cities, which soon swallows up their health, strength, and character. So what to be done about all these country bumpkins who are moving to the cesspool of the city? Well, this is actually one of the reasons for the foundation of the YMCA and the YWCA. They were created, these institutions, because reformers hoped that they might capture young rural people as they began to come to the city and provide them a wholesome environment, kind of a halfway house, helping them improve physically and mentally and spiritually before being released into the city, that they would be able to resist all the horrors and temptations. So that's the idea behind the YMCA and YWCA. And the picture in the background here, not the signs, but the actual buildings, that comes from a 1910 postcard. Those are the YWCA and the YMCA in Portland, Oregon. The YMCA there was the first founded in the Pacific Northwest back in 1868. The first here in Washington, in Seattle, was founded a few years later in 1876. Well, oddly, as it turns out, and fortuitously for historians like I, it is in such places as the YMCA and YWCA in the 19th and early 20th centuries where we historians have found some of our best evidence for gay and lesbian community and the emergence of a gay and lesbian identity. Of course, this has been the subject of one of the greatest musical compositions produced in Western civilization. So, in fact, there was a huge gay scandal involving the YMCA in Portland in 1912. And so many public documents, so many newspaper articles were written at that time, so many men arrested, that it provided the source material, one of the foundational source materials of my book, Same-Sex Affairs. And one of the things I did when I was doing that research is that I tried to trace the background of many of the men who were swept up who were arrested. So they appeared in arrest records, and so I traced them through the historical records. Many of them were associated with YMCA. Some of them actually lived there. Some of them had lived there previously, and many of them had come to Portland from rural spaces. Now, juxtaposed against this myth of queer sexuality being an urban creation is, of course, the real truth of rural America. And the person who began to blow the lid off this already in the mid-20th century was the great sexologist. Sexologist is a fancy word for a scientist who studies sex and sexuality. The great sexologist Alfred Kinsey. He produced two massive studies in mid-20th century, sexual behavior in the human male and sexual behavior in the human female. So in the book on males, he stated, and I have a quotation here, "The highest frequencies of the homosexual we," meaning him and his team of researchers, "have ever secured anywhere have been in particular rural communities, in some of the most remote sections of the country. Today it is found among ranchmen, cattlemen, prospectors, lumbermen, and farming groups in general, among groups that are virile, physically active. This type of rural homosexuality contradicts the theory that homosexuality in itself is an urban product." And I underlined this last statement to draw your attention to this myth that was developed in the late 19th century and how powerful it remained and still is today, and that Alfred Kinsey felt the need to address it. Now, the first part of this material is actually more interesting to me because I used it for clues. It gave me clues for where to look for rural queerness in the early Pacific Northwest. And lo and behold, I found it on ranches, in mining communities, in logging camps, and on farms. Okay, so I want to share one story from my book now, and it is a problematic story in many ways. And at the end of my talk, I'm going to come back and address some of the issues with historical records that relate to the problems of this story. It might seem a horrifying story to some of you, but I just want you to think, just listen to this and think about what problems might be lurking in the historical records that I used to uncover this story. Okay, so it began in February 1912 and took place in Gate. You can see it there, a small logging, milling community. There's a photograph of it from the early 20th century in the background. In 1912, when this story took place, it reached a population of about 270. So it was in one of the centers of the early logging industry in Washington. The story involved some South Asian loggers who worked for a small logging company located on the outskirts of town. Now, South Asian immigration, meaning immigration from the subcontinent of India to the West Coast, began in about 1899. And over the next couple decades, a little less than a couple decades, it was a rather small migration. Maybe a few hundred in a given year, compared to the enormous migration from Southern and Eastern Europe at this time. But on the West Coast, of course, these South Asian men were highly visible because of cultural and racial reasons. And the Northwest had been a region for some years that was very anti-Asian in sentiment. When you think about the horrible campaigns in places like Seattle and Tacoma that drove the Chinese population out in the 1880s. Well, the animus fell on South Asian men, especially in the year 1907, when several communities in different parts of the Pacific Northwest undertook campaigns to try to drive them from their communities. The most infamous, nasty, and violent of these took place in 1907 in Bellingham, just across the water here. So the Northwest, of course, had many industries, natural resource-based extractive industries that required a great deal of labor, whether it be farm labor or logging or fishing or mining. So it attracted men from across the North America, but also from overseas. And so this is why South Asians were coming to the region. And many of them found work, especially in logging and milling. So it's within this context that my story takes place. On February 12th, 1912, authorities in Gate arrested 3 South Asian men. Their names were Don Singh, Yago Singh, and Brahm Singh. The latter is pictured here. They don't seem to have been related. Singh wasn't really a family name. It had a different titular designation in northern India where these men came from. They were Sikhs. But it became kind of a name, a last name, because of the American tradition in this here in our country. So that's how they are in the records, but they don't seem to be related at all. Okay, so now the day before they were arrested, February 11th, it was a Sunday. And so work had stopped for the day. And these 3 men came to town from the logging camp and were drinking at a local saloon when a group of teenage boys, cousins to each other, local white boys, met the Singhs at the saloon and also had a few drinks, even though they were not they hadn't reached majority where they were actually permitted to, but this typically happened in these days. One of the youths was 17 years old. His name was Clarence Murray. After they drank a little bit, the cousins departed, and Murray decided to accompany the Singhs back to their quarters at the logging camp. And because they were South Asians, they were put up in a separate, segregated barracks. Now, according to Clarence's testimony in the trial that followed, he had a few more drinks and he passed out, and he only regained consciousness when these 3 South Asians were engaged in sodomizing him. The three men were convicted by a local jury, and they were sent to the state penitentiary in Walla Walla. Now, the Portland Indian community, which was the largest community in the Pacific Northwest, drew up a petition and sent it to the state requesting the early release from prison for Don Singh, only Don Singh. He was well known in the community, according to them, a sterling reputation, and the evidence against him was the least convincing. Well, in fact, all three of these men were released the following year in 1913. Don Singh actually several months before the two others. Now, Clarence Murray, by the way, married the following year. He was 18 or 19. The documents are a little bit sketchy on this. He had several children. He lived most of the rest of his life in Vancouver, Washington, where I live. He was arrested there in the 1920s for the possession of alcohol. This was during Prohibition. He and his wife divorced. Why, I don't know. And he became known as a pioneering aviator. And one of his greatest feats, recalled years later in his obituary, is when he flew his airplane in January 1930, the Columbia River froze over, and he flew his airplane under the bridge linking Portland and Vancouver and landed there, and this is a photograph of that particular event. Now, the photo of Brahm that I have on the screen actually comes from the Oregon State Prison in 1915. He was convicted of robbery in Oregon, sent to the penitentiary, and while there, authorities claim that they caught him one time in his cell having sexual relations with one of his cellmates. By then, Oregon had adopted a very harsh eugenical sterilization law. The adoption of it is actually related to the 1912 YMCA scandal. I don't have time to talk about that tonight. If anyone's interested, I could say a little bit more in the question and answer period. But the upshot of this existence of this law and this repeated sexual offense by Brahm Singh led to his sterilization. What I was able to find, he was the first prisoner in Oregon to be sterilized, and it was done through the method of castration. So I tell Brahm Singh's story in Same-Sex Affairs. That book is about men or males, but while I was doing the research for that, I occasionally came across some newspaper articles and arrest records of women or people who were assumed to be women who were arrested for wearing men's clothing, which was against the law. So I filed those away, and when I finished Same-Sex Affairs, I started doing more research on that, and it became the subject of my book after that, Redressing America's Frontier Past, which just a few years ago formed the foundational basis for an exhibit I worked on with the Washington State Historical Society. It's now closed, but it existed there for about 8 months, called Crossing Boundaries. So I want to tell one of the stories from that research, and it's my favorite, and I often tell it at events like this. It's a little bit more uplifting than the Brahm Singh story, but it's not without its sorrows and historical documentation problems. Okay, so it revolves around Joe Monahan, who was understood in his day, or really just after he died, as a woman who dressed and lived as a man. I feel comfortable referring to Joe as transgender and all that that means today. So Joe lived the better part of his life in the Owyhee country of southwestern Idaho and southeastern Oregon. He was born Johanna Monahan in Buffalo, New York in about 1850. He was assigned the female sex at birth. And reports that we have state that, as a child, Joe preferred to dress like a boy. He preferred boys' games. He preferred doing boys' chores and boys' work. Of course, that's the gendered language at the time. I don't know if there's anything masculine about delivering newspapers, but that's how our society divides the genders, every bit as rigidly as international boundaries have been drawn, and try to step from one side of one of those boundaries to the other, and you can take your life into your hands. Okay, so we also know that as a child, Joe became fascinated with stories circulating out of the Wild West. That's where he longed to be. And when he was old enough, or at least he thought he was old enough, he decided to leave Buffalo, and he showed up in the Gold Rush country. A gold rush was occurring in the 1860s in the Owyhee Mountains. And he showed up there fully presenting as a man. And he would live there for the next 4.5 decades as a man. He worked as a prospector, he worked in a sawmill, he worked for a livery stable, he even worked as a cowboy on the open range. He saved enough money to buy a little ranch on the western slope of the Owyhees, right near the Oregon border. In December 1903, he became quite ill, and it's unclear, but I think it was probably influenza that may have become pneumonia. Since he lived alone all these years, neighbors on the Oregon side of the boundary on Sucker Creek took him in and cared for him, but Joe did not improve. Rather, around the 1st of January 1904, he died. When his friends prepared his body for burial, they discovered that Joe had the body of a woman, or what they understood fully to be the body of a woman. Now, there must have been some degree of surprise. Otherwise, this story would not have leaked out of this back of beyond parcel of the American West and become a national sensation. Newspapers across the newspapers across the country carried this story. And you can see some of the headlines. These are just a few of the many, many articles. You can find them in almost every state at this time. Even the Polish press in Chicago, down here in the lower right, carried a story about Joe Monahan. But what I discovered, actually, is a somewhat more complicated story. This is part of the problem of doing research with newspapers. Newspapers were used to sell stories. There were a lot of newspapers. They were competing with each other. And as Joe's story got out, it was not told by Joe, it was told by distant journalists who imagined all kinds of crazy things about his life, completely fabricated a biography that kind of has been handed down to us and has really clouded the actual reality of Joe's life and identity. So what I discovered is that in reality, those people who knew Joe, he lived in that community for years. They really weren't surprised, or they weren't shocked so much as their discovery confirmed suspicions that they had had for many years. But they always accepted Joe as a man in their community. So I want to share with you two interesting, this is one of the things I love about being a historian, the little tidbits you can find that are so telling in historical documents. Okay, so two pieces of information giving a different view about Joe's life than these newspapers. The first is a snippet from a letter that appeared actually in the Buffalo newspaper in January 1904. So the background of this letter was written by a man named William Schnabel. William was a friend of Joe's. He knew Joe lived alone and didn't have family in Idaho. And so he thought, well, whatever family he has, they would want to know that he died, and they might benefit from the small inheritance that they could get from Joe's estate. William remembered years back when he and Joe worked together as cowboys, that occasionally when William would go to town, Joe would entrust William with letters addressed to, he vaguely remembered, Joe's sister or mother. And the last name on some of these letters to the sister was Waters or Walters. And he knew that they were sent to Buffalo. So he decided to write a letter to the Buffalo police to enlist their help, trying to track down Joe's family. The police department got the letter. They sent it over to the local newspaper, and it was printed that evening in the evening edition. And I have underlined a couple really interesting points here that I think supports this notion that that it really wasn't a surprise when Joe's clothes were removed from his body. It was always surmised that Joe was a woman, but no one could ever vouch for the truth of it. He never would reveal his identity, and all cowboys respected him. He was a small, beardless man with the hands, feet, stature, and voice of a woman. He never told a word to his best friends who he was and what he was. Okay, now this was published in a newspaper, and a lot of sensationalism in the newspaper. Why do I think that this letter is true? Well, for one thing, there really was a William Schnabel who lived in Joe's community. I verified that. But I also found another, I think even more interesting document that backs up the spirit of what Schnabel told in this letter to the Buffalo police. And that was the 1880 census. So I went to the censuses to look for any information I could find on Joe. And in 1880, I found this really interesting entry. So, you know, the census is taken every 10 years in the United States. Unfortunately, it's all computerized now. You know, well, after doing some of this research, there were a couple censuses that I was filling out that were still in paper form. And I was so happy to find these little obscure notes that I came across in this 1880 census. I wrote notes on the census to future researchers if my census is ever actually saved and digitalized someday. All kinds of fun and interesting stories. Now, unfortunately, the computerized version, the last time we had the census, there was no place to add editorial comment. So it's a thing of the past, like so much history is. Okay, so here's the 1880 census. So you can see here an enlarged entry for Joe Monahan. I found him. And you can see here next to Monahan Joseph is where the race is recorded. So that's a W for white. Next to it, the gender, or the sex, an M for male, then the number of years old, 35, which was probably incorrect. There are many errors in censuses. But if you look further to the right, you'll see an editorial comment. Can anybody read that on the screen? It says, doubtful sex. Now, this part of the census is reserved for, it didn't apply to Joe. It was a column for the relationship of people in a household, like the daughter or son would be recorded there. But for Joe, it was vacant because he lived alone. And the person who took the census wrote doubtful sex. So Joe didn't, of course, write that himself. Okay, so I knew that, the census is taken by enumerators. And I knew the federal government traditionally tried to hire people who lived in the neighborhood where the census was being conducted, especially in rural areas, because the people who lived in these rural communities knew where like a hidden ranch might be, or a cabin up a abandoned draw, or prospector, or cowboys who might be away from home out on the open range, and they knew them well enough they filled in the census for them. So I looked to see who the enumerator was, and his name is located at the upper right in the circle there, and it's written Ezra Mills. So I thought, okay, I'm going to look for Ezra Mills. Where does Ezra Mills live? I found Ezra Mills and his family on the very next page of the census, 3 households away. So this was obviously somebody who knew Joe, knew him well, was kind enough to write mail, because that's how Joe presented himself, but also, of course, had a question or suspicion, and recorded that on the census as well. Okay. Okay, so these documents show that although people who knew Joe might have had questions about him and his body when he was living, they also accepted Joe for many years in their community as either a man or someone whose gender identity was not really clear, or even as a man who had a woman's body. But no one really seemed to care. What really caught my attention in Schnabel's letter to the police was that even after Joe's death, when the truth of his body was known, Schnabel continued to refer to Joe using masculine pronouns and modifiers. Another reason I think that letter is true, because newspapers never did this. Schnabel even began his letter to the Buffalo police with a very sensitive wording: "Dear sir, there died near here a little man who has been known by all frontiersmen, such as miners and cowboys, as Joe Monahan." Okay, so as I conclude tonight, I just want to talk a little bit about historical sources and the sorts of historical sources I had to do these projects. I was never really able to find any sort of source, personal source, in the voice of the person who I was doing research on. No hidden letters, no diaries, nothing of that sort. Occasionally there were trial transcripts where you could hear the voice of the accused or of witnesses. Occasionally newspapers would carry what appeared to be an interview, but it's really hard to verify if these words came from, these newspapers tended to be extremely sensational. They wanted to sell papers, so they told a good story. So newspapers are very useful. If I didn't have newspaper articles, I could not have done Redressing America's Frontier Past. And a lot of the story is less about the reality of people's lives as it is about why their stories were recorded in the way that they were recorded. The other problem, of course, was with same-sex affairs. I had to rely principally on legal records. Had a lot of great information. You heard the story of Brahm Singh and Clarence Murray. But legal records are problematic too. These are about people who are arrested for something they did or were suspected of doing. They were brought before a legal system that was prejudiced automatically against these people. So it says nothing about the reality of their lived experiences. It tells about the prejudices of the society that's passed these laws and applies these laws and sterilizes these people. So these sources are problematic. More recently, fortunately, we're able to collect oral histories, and in more recent times, people are willing to preserve letters and diaries that in old days families may have found and burned. Emily Dickinson's private letters and materials were burned by one of her nieces because they were seen to be too revealing. So this is a call for people, and you don't have to be a queer person to, I mean, people use Facebook and all these, and people text today. How much of that stuff is actually stored and retrieved? So I really encourage people wherever I go to keep letters if you still write the darn things. I preserve correspondence in email, a few key correspondence. I save them, and every few years I print them all out and I stick them away in a box. And I also keep a daily diary, a daily journal, and I've been doing so since June of 1983. I'll write about you tonight. This is a great way to get back at your enemies, too. There's a lot of good uses for journals and diaries. So, for example, my husband and I have been together almost 30 years now, so throughout our entire time together, I've kept a journal, which is, of course, the authority on our relationship. And he doesn't keep a diary, he doesn't keep a journal, he's not interested in that kind of stuff. And so whenever we have this is one of the uses of diaries, whenever we have a disagreement over when an event happened in the past or how things actually played out, he has to rely on his memory. But I have my trusty journal. The journals have their drawbacks because I've found that usually my journal supports his memory and not mine. So one of the lessons, if you don't ever enter into an unwinnable debate with your spouse, look at your diary first. Okay, I'm happy to take questions. I don't know if you'll get any answers, but we have some time for that. I love it when I leave the audience speechless. Yes.
You mentioned that something you said you didn't have time to talk about, but maybe we can bring it up now.
Yeah, the very sad story of eugenical sterilization in our country, and the models our system of eugenical sterilization actually provided models that the Nazis in Germany studied. So it's kind of a very sad story and has a lot to do with racism and ableism and all these sorts of things. So eugenics movement was really big in the late 19th and early 20th century. And kind of the going real far out into the eugenical movement was a campaign to adopt laws for the sterilization of people who were considered to be unfit to procreate because they were bringing down the race. Okay, there were all kinds of more interesting and potentially less damaging parts of eugenics. You know, they used to have these fairs where people would bring their babies and put them on display, and the babies would be judged to be the healthiest and the most robust and those sorts of things. So there are these types of things, but the negative, the worst side of eugenics was sterilization. So many laws in many states in the early 20th century adopted laws to sterilize people. And, it was really difficult to do this because of the constitutional right, embedded in the Bill of Rights and these sorts of things. But one of the most successful and earliest states to adopt eugenical sterilization was the state of Oregon. The campaign was led by a woman physician. There weren't a lot of, she's typically seen as kind of a heroine to the feminist movement because she's such an early example of a woman who was able to make it through medical school and practice and this sort of thing. The other side is, of the coin is that she was very hell-bent on sterilization. So she worked in Washington and Oregon to pass sterilization laws, and typically this was really difficult to do. The state legislatures typically balked. Well, the idea then was to kind of limit how sterilization would happen in society. And so the laws she began to write and propose were somewhat more limited, that people who were wards of the state in state hospitals, state prisons, reform schools, they could be sterilized if they were repeat offenders. So they had to make all these, to kind of narrow down the people that this would be applied to get it accepted at a broader social level. Well, okay, so she was successful in Washington before Oregon, many reversals, disappointing reversals, and then this huge gay scandal occurred in Portland in November of 1912. This was big. It was big news, and some really important and significant people, but not only really important and significant people in the city were involved, but these were white men who were involved, not, the Brahms Singhs and the Don Singhs, but, sexual perversion was invading white middle-class Portland society. And so the new legislative session began in January of 1913, right in the midst of this scandal. And it gave new fodder to this physician. Her name was Bithynia Owens Adair, but her great ally was the governor of Oregon, Oswald West. And you can see very clearly in the documents, Oswald West at the beginning of the legislative session addressing the Oregon legislature, specifically on the perverts that have been recently uncovered in Portland and the reason why we need to have sterilization of people who are arrested and end up in prison in order to clean these people out of society. Now, the understanding of something you might have called in the time homosexuality or sexual perversion, again, was not so much of an identity, but as a disease that could be spread from people to people. And so it wasn't necessarily unthinkable that someone we would call gay would, procreate and have children. So in order to prevent them from doing so, but also for reasons of punishment, sterilization was adopted in Oregon, and sterilization through castration. Now, the Oregon voters later in 1913 had a repeal of that law, but it was swiftly repassed by the legislature with just a few modifications, but it directly connects back to the 1912 YMCA scandal. Yes, in the back.
Did any of your research cover queerness in the indigenous communities of the area?
Yeah, it did. I am not an indigenous person, and so I try to avoid doing indigenous history. But, this is mental gymnastics that these medical officials went through. So, there was this, as I explained, this concern about urban society. And the term they used often was degenerating. The degeneration of the human race, and especially people in urban areas and all these nervous diseases that were affecting them. But the other thing, and I didn't do this so much from the perspective of indigenous people, I've been around a long time, and for many years I actually taught Native American history. It was the most difficult subject to teach, especially because I'm not indigenous. So I have made choices in my research to just avoid that and let others, especially indigenous people, tell that story. But what I did do, I wrote quite a bit about this in Redressing America's Frontier Past, because the physicians who were discussing sexual perversion as a degeneracy of urban spaces, they also, oddly enough, in their examples of degeneracy, spoke about the native savage peoples of North America as being sexually perverted and degenerate as well. So there's kind of like two things going on. Urban society, which is new and uncertain what's happening and where this country's going and what's really going to happen to the political power of people in rural areas and small towns. But at the same, on the other end of the spectrum, the people who were being conquered and put onto reservations in the West, the argument was because they're degenerate and also sexually perverted. So, but yeah, quite a bit of anthropologists and historians have written extensively on indigenous people and their multi-gender systems, you know, third and fourth sexes and genders. And there's been quite a bit of research done here in the Pacific Northwest, and typically I use some of those writings in my classes for students to read. Yes.
Castration implies a genetic transmission of a condition, and yet they talk about homosexuality being contagious, or the perversion being a contagion. Was there anybody speaking about what mental gymnastics did they do to make that connection?
Right, so, you know, genetics, the way we understand it today, wasn't really fully formed in the late 19th and early 20th century. They talked about eugenics, but they did talk about heritable traits, but including in that, this is how they didn't quite understand the way we understand genetics, but heritable traits were also things that people could develop in their lifetime, and then those could be passed on to. So there were two different ways that genetics was understood at the time, and I forget the term, but one was congenital and one was acquired. And so it was believed that, for example, one of the big arguments against alcohol and, you know, shutting down saloons was because, you know, alcoholism or just drinking a lot, you could pass that on genetically to your children, or if you develop some sort of mental disease. I mean, some of these things are inherited, but a lot of the crazy things, like that they talked about as acquired in your lifetime, as all of a sudden becoming part of your what we would call genetic makeup. They didn't use that term, but that could be passed on to your children.
And yet they continued and persisted in declaring that schizophrenia was the fault of the mother.
Things like that. Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned that there was plenty of evidence of queers in rural spaces, and it makes sense that a lot of that evidence would come from sort of legal records. And I'm wondering if you found any evidence of like communities of queers or communities that were supportive of their queer members as opposed to just loners or criminals.
But I would say, the records that I uncovered for Portland, thankfully, 2 huge trial transcripts were preserved. 2 of the men who were convicted in Portland, one was a doctor and one was a lawyer, and they appealed their cases to the Oregon Supreme Court. And so all that material from the county level, which counties tend to get rid of in time because there's just too much material, those were preserved in the Oregon Supreme Court archives, and I was able to get a hold of those. Now, those trial transcripts, a lot of witnesses, a lot of the other men who were arrested were used as witnesses by the prosecution. And so it did become clear to me, these men, that they had, many of them had close friendships, many of them had known each other for years. They talked about places they would go and hang out together, and parks that they met in, parties they would go to. So that clearly indicates a type of community among these people. But, as far as nothing like any of these rushed to the defense, and it was simply too dangerous to do this because this was against the law, and you could be arrested and prosecuted yourself. So, yeah, unfortunately, I didn't find that sort of thing. Occasionally, you would find couples that had been together for many years and were supportive through their life and that sort of thing, but not communities that you're thinking of. Yes.
One thing you really haven't talked about is whether this was religiously linked historically, or was this just socially?
Yeah, I'm usually criticized for ignoring religion in my work. And my last book, actually, I deal quite a bit with it. So for example, one of the things, I did Redressing America's Frontier Past. The book wasn't really quite about that sort of thing. But since the Portland scandal really was one of the foundations of same-sex affairs, I went into great detail about the city of Portland and the reforms. And I didn't really bring this out, but the YMCA, it was a Christian organization. And one of the things that happens in Portland as a result of this scandal is the putting together of this committee. It was called the Committee of 50, made up of community leaders. And a lot of them were pastors and ministers of the not the Catholic, but Protestant faiths. And so they were involved in what was essentially a vice committee that then went about and studied officially vice in Portland when the great reports from the period came out in 1913, the year after. And it was really led by a lot of these ministers. So, there's that connection. Yes.
When we want to tell these stories about hear people throughout time, and a lot of them there's not a lot of information, or they've been buried by either the people or by their families. I guess my question is, how can we tell these stories while honoring the people who try to keep it hidden?
Yeah, I really struggled with that, especially in the book on people who dressed and lived lives as the other sex or the opposite sex. And, even that terminology is problematic. But what I tried to do is I tried to go back into, I think one of the fun things about doing history is, not just telling the stories from the past, but trying to understand the people at the time and how they made sense of this and the terms that they used. So, some of the people that I found in redressing America's frontier past, they appeared over years in records. One of the most famous ones was from Seattle, Harry Allen, who was a female to male person, or identified as male. And he was, before the law, time after time and time and time. He was constantly harassed for being who he was. And so there are people like that who you have kind of almost a longitudinal history of, that you would I would feel comfortable calling them transgender. But I tried to avoid those terms like that in my work. Now, some people disagree with me, and I've had people criticize me for not using those terms, but they just don't ring right to me for the people in the times that I'm studying. But I mean, I called Joe transgender, so I do feel comfortable doing that. Now, a lot of these people, there's just a little snippet, they were arrested here, they disappear from the record. They might appear in one newspaper article, you never hear from them again, so you don't really know their full story. And if they are interviewed in the press, even Harry Allen did this when he was arrested in Portland. The newspapers report he broke down under questioning and said, I'm not a man, I'm really a girl. But they're forced to do this. Could you imagine yourself in such a situation? It was federal authorities questioning him. So it's really hard. So I think what one has to do is just to be super sensitive and do a lot of explaining. That's what this question about indigenous people, when I was teaching, this is what I learned teaching Native American history, that, oh, wow, I'm a white person, what do I really know about this? And so I ended up, it was challenging, it was frustrating, it was exhilarating. I spent most of my time explaining language rather than the history. This is kind of why I got out of that line of work. And I'm not transgender. I don't identify that way, and I just tried to do the best I could and try to see, what did they say? Like, Joe Monahan lived as a man for years. He was a man. That's who he was. That's how he lived. That's how he presented. So try to understand them on their terms. Okay? Good. Thank you very much for your attention.